Hello and welcome to my channel, Sew Amelia. I'm Amelia and this is where I talk about making a handmade wardrobe for me and my children. Welcome to this week's video, which is a sew-along for the Valerie Dress by Forget Me Not Patterns. Now recently Jo from Forget Me Not Patterns reached out to me and asked if I would like to test the re-release of their pattern, the Valerie Dress. Now when I looked at this pattern with its beautiful raglan sleeve shaping and the pocket details, I couldn't say no. I've made the Iris Tee by Forget Me Not Patterns before and I just love their detailing in the pattern and the style lines that she chooses to use in her patterns. I also love the instructions. The instructions for Forget Me Not Patterns are brilliant. They are so detailed but also really clear to follow. And they come with some instructional videos as well, which I found really helpful. So I decided to sew up the Valerie Dress. Now this pattern has recently been re-released in the extended size range, which goes from a size 28 to a size 52, which has a top measurement of 56.5 inches for the hip. Now there were just two options before for the sleeves. There was the short sleeve with a flounce and the long sleeve with a cuff. There is now a 3/4 length gathered sleeve, and most brilliantly of all, the pattern has been released with 3 different sizes for the bodice, for a small bust, a B-cut bust and then a full bust, which is just fabulous. I'm someone who has a much smaller bust than my waist and hip measurements, and so to be able to grade my pattern down to the size that suited my bust meant I didn't have to be doing any fiddly small bust adjustments or grading of the pattern. I was just able to make a straight size 36. So my measurements are a bust of 36 inches, a waist of 30 inches and hips of 41 inches. Now if I make the small bust version of the dress, 36 is a 35.5 inch bust. The waist is 29.5 inches and the hips are 40.5 inches, so about half an inch smaller than my measurements for each one of those measurements. However, when I look at the finished garment measurements, the finished garments give me a bust of 37.5 inches and a waist of 30.25 inches, and it's an A-line skirt, so I wasn't too concerned about the hip measurements, although those are 45 inches, so again I've got a good amount of ease there. So I did decide to go with a size 36. This is meant to be quite a fitted bodice, and I thought if I made the size 36 and it was too small, I could just use the seam allowance in the zip at the back to give me a little bit more wiggle room. But as you'll see through the video, I didn't end up needing to do that. So in terms of sizing, there are really fabulous detailed size charts in the pattern instructions, and it was no problem looking through and choosing my size. I especially liked having those 3 different options for the bust sizes of the bodice, and then being able to see very clear finished garment measurements to decide which size I wanted to make to fit my body. All that to say, I hope you enjoy the sew along. If you haven't yet subscribed, I would so appreciate if you would, and hit that notification icon as well so that you'll be made aware of when I publish future vlogs. I hope you enjoy the sew along, and I'll see you at the end of the video. I started by laying out the pattern pieces on my fabric, taking care with the direction of the print. I then cut the pieces out with my rotary cutter. When I was finished, I had a skirt front and back piece, a pocket piece and a pocket facing, a front and a back bodice with 2 neck facing pieces, as well as a flounce and 2 sleeve pieces. Before sewing, I needed to prepare the pattern pieces. I applied fusing to the centre back of the skirt pieces and stay tape to the neckline of the front bodice piece. I marked the darts on the front bodice piece and pinned those into place. I sewed the darts into place before giving them a good press. I then repeated this process for the darts in the back bodice and in the skirt pieces. Finally, I added interfacing to my front and back neck facing pieces, and then I was ready to sew. I started by pinning the side seams of the bodice together before sewing those at the machine, and then finishing those seams on my overlocker. I then gave the side seams of the bodice a good press. Next, I folded the sleeve piece in half and matched the notches and the dots before pinning that dart into place and sewing it at the machine. I finished the seam on my overlocker before giving the sleeve dart a good press. I sewed up the side seam of each sleeve, and then it was time to attach them to the bodice. I carefully pinned the sleeve to the bodice, making sure to match the side seams, the neckline edges, and all the notches. I stitched the sleeve to the bodice before finishing the edges on my overlocker. I then gave the sleeve and the bodice a good press. With the sleeves in place, I had a completed bodice, and it was on to the next step, sewing up the skirt. I pinned the pocket-facing pieces into place on the front of the main skirt piece. I sewed these into place and gave them a good press before understitching the pocket facing to the seam allowance. I pinned the pocket bag onto the pocket facing piece, sewed this into place and finished the raw edges before folding the pocket piece back into place and basting it to the main skirt piece. The next step was to sew up the side seams of the skirt, pressing those carefully before moving on to pinning the bodice to the skirt. I sewed up the waist seam, finished it on my overlocker, and pressed it up towards the top of the bodice. Next, I placed the neck-facing pieces together, pinning them and sewing them, and finishing the outer edge on my overlocker before giving it the facing a good press. It was at this point that I decided to sew on one of my labels from my Kylie and the Machine advent calendar. To prepare for adding the invisible zip, I finished the edges of the centre back seam all the way from the neckline down to the hem of the skirt. I pinned the zip into place, carefully following the measurements and the pattern instructions. I then sewed the invisible zip into place before sewing from the hemline up towards the bottom of the invisible zip. I then gave this centre back seam a good press. I pinned the side of the facing pieces to the edge of the bodice and then sewed this into place. I then flipped the neckline facing around and pinned it to the neckline, making sure to match up all of the seams and the notches. I sewed the neckline seam. I clipped into the seam allowance and then understitched the facing to the bodice. I turned the facing to the inside of the garment, gave the neckline edge a good press. I then hand sewed the facing to the seam lines to keep it securely in place. Then it was time to add the sleeve flounce. I sewed the two short edges of the flounce together, finished these edges on the overlocker before giving the flounce a good press. I pressed a small hem into place and sewed that at the machine. I pinned the flounce to the sleeve, making sure to match up the underarm seams before sewing that into place and overlocking the raw edges. Finally, I sewed the hem and the dress was finished. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the sew along and hearing about how I found the pattern. I really enjoyed this make, and I'm looking forward to adding some more Valerie dresses to my wardrobe in the future. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead filled with lots of happy sewing, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Goodbye!